Hello and welcome to The Edition from The Spectator. I'm Lara Prendergast, The Spectator's executive editor, and the latest issue of the magazine has just gone to press. To discuss what's in it, I'm joined now by our deputy editor and the editor of our US edition, Freddy Gray, our columnist, Douglas Murray, and the new editor of our Life section, Arabella Byrne. This week's cover has the headline, The Guilty Men, and in it, our editor, Michael Gove, looks at the three men in senior political positions who he says are undermining Britain's national security. Freddie, I thought I'd start by asking you to outline who these three men are.
Well, there's lots of guilty men in Britain, but we've put three of them on the cover. Jonathan Powell, who's the National Security Advisor, and he's been sort of involved in so much important stuff in British politics in the last couple of decades. And he's not really highlighted, or his malevolence not really highlighted enough, and Michael's done a very good job of highlighting it here. The other two that we put on the cover are Lord Hermer, who's the Attorney General, and Philippe Sands, who's this international law barrister. And they are all close to Keir Starmer, who's the Prime Minister. So I suppose really the guilty man in this story is Keir Starmer. And an interesting dimension of this, Michael in the piece talks a lot about the Chagos deal, which may now thankfully be stopped. But a lot of people are very mystified as to why the Chagos deal, why were we handing over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius? And Donald Trump, who sort of raised concerns about it last week, called it an act of stupidity, said, I don't understand why Britain's doing this. Do they need the money? And the answer to that is, well, yes, we do need the money, but we're not getting any money from it. We're actually paying billions, possibly up to £34 billion, to give the islands back to the Mauritius, which is a kind of vassal state of China. And what's interesting about what Keir Starmer's doing on the international stage generally, and he's in Beijing at the moment this week, is that the urge is always to gravitate more towards China as the future superpower and away from America. And you're hearing people say, China's very concerned about how close Britain is to America, as though that's a real problem. And I think if you want to sort of, you can sound a bit right-wing and paranoid to sort of talk about a left-wing conspiracy to undermine Britain. Yeah. But,
this is the place to do
But
that.
the reason we talk about that is because it's partly true. There are people that think our national interest is not actually important and that there's a sort of body of international law that is more important. And the problem for Britain is these people are now running the country.
Well, Douglas, you wrote about Lord Hermer last year and you talked about his campaign against Britain. What did you make of our collection of three guilty men on the cover?
I think they're three very good prime targets, that's for sure. The editor in his piece highlights, as Freddie said, Jonathan Powell, whose involvement in the Northern Ireland peace process is one that Michael and I have both been very interested in for many years. An argument that absolutely anybody involved in the peace process in Northern Ireland should be praised because it happened and it's held, broadly speaking. However, the price at which it was created is something that many of us remain critical of, not least Powell's decision to go round the back of most official channels, directly negotiate with the IRA. And of course, as Michael points out in his piece, Powell became so close to the lead members of Sinn Féin IRA that Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness were invited to Jonathan Powell's wedding. Well, many of us think that McGuinness and Adams, they attended more funerals than weddings in their time, most of them caused by themselves. But anyway, it's a little sign of the closeness of Powell in a way that I think significantly undermined Britain's interests at that time. Hermer and Philippe Sands are a different type of beast in a way. As Freddie said, what they really believe is that there is this international law that floats way above mere national law and way above mere concerns like that of the British electorate, so that you get these situations. And to be fair, this has happened under so-called conservative governments, as well as under this Labour government. They seem to believe that really the most important thing is for Britain to subvert herself completely to international law, and to do so even if nobody else is, in order to sort of show people by example, because you and I all know that the world is desperately looking for moral example always from these islands. And of course, this reaches its apotheosis in a way in the Chagos deal. Of course, Sands is actually representing the Mauritian government in this deal, which you would have thought in most situations would be a conflict of interest. But the fascinating thing is that and Freddie, this goes back to the sort of bigger geopolitical thing that Freddie refers to. whether we tack ourselves to the US, as historically has been our thing, or more towards China. The people who are pro-China, pro-CCP rather, in this, tend to say, well, America is abandoning international law. And you go, oh, have I got news for you about the Chinese Communist Party? But the really interesting thing is that at a time when other countries, including our allies like America, are looking at consolidating power, only Britain continues to be in this position, principally because of people like Powell, Hermer, Sands, and so on, where we treat everything we own as if we've got a bunch of hot televisions that have been sold to us off the back of a truck, and we've got to get rid of them all fast. That seems to be the British government's attitude towards the Chagos Islands. It's a horrible deal. It's a ridiculous deal. It's not a deal in any understandable sense of the term. And of course, what's interesting is that, to my mind, it's very good that the American president's come out criticizing the Chagos so-called deal. But of course, one of the interesting things about it is, if these islands belonged to America, islands that give you a serious strategic foothold, there is no way in which a president of the United States, Democrat or Republican, would give up that territory. Only Britain in the 21st century seems to think that it's necessary, probably to expiate our historical guilt, of course, for accumulating land in the past in the period of empire. Only we seem to think that our principal job is to give away the family silver, sell it off, or pay people to take it away from us, in order that we set this putative example to the rest of the world. An example, by the way, which absolutely nobody is going to follow.
Michael makes the point that none of these men are elected, and he says at one point that Powell's control of foreign policy is firmer than either of Starmer's foreign secretaries has been. Is that a slightly alarming position?
That's not hard to say. I mean, both of the Labour foreign secretaries so far are utter ignoramuses. Know nothing about the international stage, have embarrassed themselves in public and private meetings when they're on it. So, in Starmer's defense, you might say, well, I haven't got any foreign secretary who's able to do the job, so I might as well use the usual backroom emissary in Powell, and
who is intelligent. I don't think that's in any doubt. I mean, all these three men are very intelligent. And that is the thing. It's Machiavellian, intelligent people making decisions behind the scenes, while you have a sort of front bench of, as Douglas suggests, ignoramuses.
And what do you think they would make of the argument that Michael is making, that they are undermining Britain? Do you think they would see it that way?
I'm sure they'd say Michael Gove has done much more to undermine Britain than they have, but that's a matter of hot debate. I think Douglas is quite right to point out this uniquely British combination of self-hatred and self-importance that we have to set. It's similar with net zero emissions. Yes. Even though Britain's contribution to global greenhouse emissions is minimal, and we actually, export it all to other countries to do our emitting for us, there's this assumption that we have to show a country like China as though they'd listen, or as though they'd want to follow our example. We have to show them through the power of our tiny example how to behave. And it's similar with what you see in international law, and it's delusional.
Talking of Starmer, we obviously have Starmer on the cover. Tim Shipman has also written his political column about Keir Starmer. He says that Starmer is trying to reset his government right now, whether it's standing up to Trump, standing up to Andy Burnham. Do you think that's plausible at all, Douglas?
Well, I mean, he probably should do a reset, but if he starts resetting, he probably won't stop. I mean, he can do as many resets as he wants. He's not going to solve the fundamental problems, which include this problem simply of who runs the country. Are we run by Parliament, by the majority party who nominate their leader, who then is Prime Minister? Are we actually ruled that way? Or are we ruled by foreign courts? Even 10 years after the British public voted for us not to be ruled by foreign courts, whatever you think about that. Or are we ruled by international law? Because even when the public say, for instance, they overwhelmingly want to stop the small boats or the arrival of illegals, or at least how about just deporting illegals who arrive in Britain and rape somebody immediately? How about that, just as a test case? Oh, no. The international lawyers swoop in and they say, no. This person who broke into your country illegally and then raped somebody has to be treated as if they were a British subject, had been all their lives and so on. This is the sort of thing that gets down to everyday business. It's not just about things like the Chagos Islands. It's about literally who we have in our country and what we can do with people when they're in our country. And Starmer is not going to address this because this whole fog of international law is the fog that he comes from. It's what he's spent his life advocating for. So no, he can move around the odd foreign secretary. We'll keep on forgetting what the name of the defense secretary is. And he can do that all he likes. But until you address this question, how are we actually ruled? And who does the ruling? You can reset all you like.
Arabella, do you think Reform are offering some answers to these questions?
In the case of Burnham and Starmer this week, just to get back to that, I think that actually Sam Leith wrote a brilliant piece, I think it was on Coffee House this week, about the narcissism of small differences and how really this is a sideshow, this Burnham-Starmer thing, because fundamentally we need to make decisions, as Douglas says, about who rules us and how serious a Labour reset might be. Do I think Reform? I mean, I was a Tory voter and now I vote for Reform, much to the horror of my family, who are, lifelong Conservatives. They can't believe that this has happened. I think what is going to happen in the by-election is really, I think that's exciting and I think that's really interesting. And I think the fault lines of British politics are really going to become apparent there. If you've got Zach Polanski's party and someone like Matt Goodwin who offers, I think he's a fresh voice. I mean, tar him all you like. I think he's, I think he's a clever guy, and I think he's got a narrative that's very compelling.
And he's not an ex-Tory minister, which is beneficial because, I mean, we have seen in the last few days a dipping in the polls for Reform. And, a lot of people are concluding that it's because Reform voters don't want an ex-Tory party. They want something completely different. They're totally fed up with the two-party political system. They are depressed by the thought of taking on all these people who belong to a government that they think wrecked the country. So I think there is that. But I think there is certainly that there are people within Labour who think they've got a bit of momentum. And those people are always wrong. But it is true that Keir Starmer has a new comms strategy. I don't know if you saw him putting on aviator sunglasses.
He's pushing this idea of his active government, which whatever he's been up to for the last year.
Well, they were talking about Macron. He said, "Oh, well, in fairness to Macron, he has a problem with his eye. That's why he's wearing aviators." And then the comedian, whoever it was, gave him a pair of aviators, and he put them on. And he said bonjour, and everyone said ha ha ha. And you could see Labour people clipping it, going, "Oh, yeah, actually, Keir Starmer does have a personality." But in fact, he really wants to be a kind of Carney. Everyone was very excited by Carney's speech. The Canadian leader at Davos. Was it last week? It was last week. I lose track of time. And that's become a sort of blueprint now for how the centre will save itself. The political centre can save itself by admitting that there is such a thing as sovereignty, admitting that there are concerns.
Argue the middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. In a world of great power rivalry, the countries in between have a choice. Compete with each other for favor, or to combine to create a third path with impact.
But actually, if you listen, Davos people have been saying that for a long time. They just don't ever do anything about it, and they're just trying to mitigate the problem.
Exactly.
And that's very much what Starmer's like. And that's all his nods towards the right are always that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be totally unpersuasive for Starmer to start speaking a different political language or have a different set of political morals now. I just wanted to say something quickly about the Reform thing. I can understand those Reform voters who believe that, there's something too Tory about people coming in. That's why, actually, when Nigel Farage said the other week that he would get a high-level Labour defection quite soon, and it didn't happen, it's rightly been pointed out to him, because that would sort of give a certain equilibrium to the defectors into his party. Nevertheless, there is an interesting, quite important difference here, which is... Well, remember back in the days of UKIP, a couple of Conservatives defected to UKIP. There were some fine people like Douglas Carswell. But perhaps most notoriously, they got Neil Hamilton.
Oh, yes.
Who, after the Cash for Questions scandal and various other things, rocked up as sort of, I think, leader of UKIP in Wales. Now, that really is demoralising for your UKIP voter. And...
was this before or after the reality TV show?
Very
much after. Yes.
But that isn't the case with getting someone like Suella Braverman, because one of the things that's interesting about her defection is, of course, is that Suella Braverman was seen by the public, if they were looking closely at it, was seen to be trying to do things in government as Home Secretary, including securing the borders, including deporting illegals, including stopping the hate marches. And Rishi Sunak and co. squashed her every single time, visibly, ostentatiously, publicly. So the interesting thing about the Suella Braverman defection is it's not the case that this is a washed-up Conservative politician who, sort of has seen that there's a different vessel that's going to be more seaworthy and jumped onto it. It's actually somebody who we know from her record in office came right up against this system, however you want to say it, the international lawyers, the sort of Hermer Sands class, tried very hard to battle them and lost the battle because there was not leadership above her which supported that battle to just do things like securing the borders and so on. So I actually think if I was speaking to Reform voters to try to shore them up about that, that would be one of the things I would emphasise.
Well, yes, and I think that would take Braverman to go on the front foot in criticising the Tories while she was in government, because otherwise, I mean, the problem is, Douglas's point is completely right, but the problem is for voters, they probably don't really remember Braverman very much. They'll just see that she's an ex-Tory, they'll recognise that she was part of that chaotic period. They won't know that she was incredibly squashed and sort of sneered at by everyone in high Tory circles for a long time. If she were to talk about that very aggressively and so on, that might work.
But I also think there's a kind of colour blindness that comes with every defection, and they're coming quite thick and fast now, is that to the public, this, reform just becomes a kind of holding pen for, disaffected Tories. So how do you distinguish? How does Nigel seize the narrative and say, this is not a retirement home for disaffected, Tories.
Well, he's done something very clever with that, of course, hasn't he? By doing the moratorium on defections. I can't remember when it is. I thought it was a very clever move.
Yeah, no.
It means that first of all, you put real pressure on the Conservative Party and anyone who is thinking of defecting, and then you say, but after that, you're all in. And Matt Goodwin, as you know, is a good candidate for the by-election, precisely because he never has been part of the Tory party, so far as I know. Yeah,
no, he's clean. I mean, there's a certain freshness to him.
If they are going to be serious about taking office, they have to make sure that they arrive in office on day one of Trump's second presidency and not on day one of Trump's first presidency. If they come in not knowing which levers to pull and so on, they will be subsumed by all of the Jonathan Powells and all of the Hermers and all of the Sandses, and they will all crop up on the Today programme and say, the public may have voted overwhelmingly for this policy, but we find that this is not legal. And of course, what is not legal will always very comfortably fit with their own political prejudices. But yes, if they arrive in, as Trump has second time, with the equivalent of executive orders and so on, then it's a very different beast. And that's why the Braverman one, I think, is important, because that is somebody who can say, I tried, and these are the things that will run against you. And these are the things you just have to clear from your path if you're actually going to run the country. And see through the policies you've promised the electorate once again to give them.
Douglas, talking of Trump, your column this week, you bring together the ICE arrests in America and the Iranian protests, and you talk about the importance of visuals for creating momentum behind a story. Could you elaborate a bit on what you're saying?
Well, sure. I mean, it's, I mentioned these two things because, of course, there have been these two shootings of anti-ICE demonstrators in Minnesota. And, these are very significant moments and terrible moments for a number of reasons. One is that ICE, the federal agency responsible for taking illegal immigrants out of the US, is acting on the mandate not just of the president, but of the majority of the American vote. He got he did actually, Trump in the last election did win the popular vote. And if there's one thing Trump said repeatedly on the campaign trail he was going to do, it was going to be to get out the foreign criminals who shouldn't have been in America in the first place. So he's seeing that promise through. ICE agents are doing that. Now, there are some Democrat politicians, including in Minnesota, it has to be said, who've been saying to the general public, you should come out and stop ICE. They should not be on our streets. This is, by the way, in any season, that is very unwise. Very unwise for a politician to say to members of the general public, make sure you confront and stop people who are federal agents going about their business, let alone if they're heavily armed. This isn't a cosplay, this isn't a pantomime. Of course, America is roiling itself apart at the moment on several things. One is the idea that what has happened is 2 peaceful protesters have been shot. And this is a very knotty area, because actually it's one thing to be standing on the side of a road with a sign saying, F ICE or whatever, or ICE out, and quite another thing to be deliberately throwing yourselves in their path. Now, the reason I think this is interesting is lots of things. One is that anyone who's been in America or followed American protests and events in the last decade or so knows that all of us who do so, become lamentably over-informed about ballistics, trajectories, mortuary photographs, and how we might have acted at the moment that we discovered that a protester had a handgun on them, and so on. Sadly, this is an aspect of American life which has become very, very prominent. But I mention it, one reason is, of course, is that almost everyone in America now carries a camera phone. And the police and ICE agents have body cam footage. And you'll have noticed this week with this latest shooting in Minnesota, within under an hour, we've all got the shooting on our X feed. By a couple of hours in, we've got several different angles on it. Everyone can give their take, their hot take, their wrong take, or their correct take, whatever.
Or their AI take.
Or their AI take, absolutely. With the one where one of the men didn't have a head, or something. I mean, one of the arresting officers didn't have a head. I mean, there's so much we're just not prepared for in this. But I contrast this with the situation in Iran, because it is striking to me that if the figures that are coming out from Iran of the Iranian protesters who are standing up against the revolutionary Islamic government, if it's true that 30,000 people more have been gunned down in the last couple of weeks by the Basij militia and other forces of the Iranian government, this is something which surely in any season would cause howls of outrage from around the world. I mean, we don't need to ask why the sort of pro-Palestinianists aren't out on the streets. We know that because they're hot for the Ayatollah. And if there's no Jews, there's no news, obviously. But internationally, why has there not been more outcry about this? And one thing is, Trump himself said, if we see, public executions, then we're going to come in. Well, of course, the Ayatollahs have decided to turn off the internet.
So interesting.
You make sure that you can't get the information out. And as a result, in an era where we are obsessed with having to see the video of the event for it to be true, here is this totalitarian society where the mullahs are able to turn off the internet. Some brave dissidents from Iran have smuggled some footage out, but there hasn't been the amount of footage of these tens of thousands of people, often students, being massacred in the streets. The videos, some of them are there, some of them you have to sadly have to search for. But imagine if this information flow did happen from Tehran as it does from Minnesota, maybe the world's priorities would be different. And I don't think we've understood yet the extent to which our news and our priorities are manipulated by the incredible prominence of the visual medium in our time.
Well, Arabella, what do you make of Douglas's point that if it doesn't happen online, then it hasn't happened? I mean, it's quite an alarming thought.
I find it very depressing, really, that, the medium through which we see the world is X or, or Instagram, particularly, I guess X is more political and Instagram seems to be more cultural or social or however you want to slice it. I think that's depressing. I think it's certainly, as Douglas rightly points out, certain things do happen that we don't see. And the fact that a theocracy can just turn the internet off is, it's alarming. I think it's become so hot it's cold. I think we've become so manipulated by visual media that we don't even know it's happening. I mean, just for example, I was reading my daughter a book last night and I was looking at a picture in a book and I tried with my fingers to enlarge it.
Wow.
So, and that's really frightening to me because it was involuntary, and it was quite an old book. We were reading Judith Kerr when Hitler stole Pink Rabbit, and it has illustrations.
Why did you go to me on when Hitler stole Pink
but I
Rabbit?
feel like
I'm a famous reader of Pink Rabbit Hitlerian books. Why I never even heard of this thing?
I'm disappointed to hear that.
Don't act all in it.
As our resident Hitler Pink Rabbit correspondent.
You, Mr. Pink Rabbit, come on. She said, "Mummy, can I look at the picture?" And I went like that. And she said, "But what are you doing?" So look, I was pulled up by her, an 8-year-old, a digital native, and she said, "Why are you doing that?" And it really alarmed me because I suddenly thought, "Oh my God, you mustn't see me doing that." And it's like I always say, "Why are you looking at your phone, Mummy?" I always say, "I'm sorry, I don't."
I think the watching videos of murders and killings is so commonplace now, and it is revolting. And I think, Douglas, you've written about this. When I was a teenager, there was a sort of very illicit video called Executions, and it was considered like the most depraved thing you could do to watch it. And at school, I remember a boy put it on, the physics teacher walked out, and a boy put it on and I remember watching it, and I remember thinking, this is absolutely, I was really shocked by what we saw, because it was sort of footage of executions. And now, all of our children will have seen people being shot in the head on a regular basis. I preach about this like I'm better than others, but I mean, I watched the video, the shooting from several different angles, because you just get sort of sucked into it and you find yourself analysing frame by frame, this sort of, and it's complete madness, really. And I think there should be a stigma, ideally, but there won't be. There should be a stigma towards watching a video of a killing, because it's worse than pornography.
Well, Freddie and I have memory of this because I think you're too young to remember this, barrister, both of you. But I remember that when 12 years ago at The Spectator, we had a very intense debate about the ISIS videos.
I do remember this when I just started.
You just started.
Yeah.
And you remember, it was a very important debate because we knew we were being manipulated by ISIS in their beheading videos. And as I remember it, the debate in the end revolved around, on one hand, everyone knew you couldn't keep the story from the public, and maybe the public did need to know the actual barbarism of this group. On the other hand, there was, do we want to live in a society that has become so immune to violence, that this is something that you wake up to, and you see the video. If you go back to 2002 and the beheading of the Wall Street Journal journalist Daniel Pearl, his parents and others spent years campaigning, among other things, in tribute to their son, to stop the video of his killing that had been put out by Al-Qaeda from going around online. Now we live in this era where all of these things are online. And you say, I mean, you could click on these and get a dozen different angles and body cam footages. And again, I mean, just like we haven't caught up, we're probably not going to catch up for a long time with what the AI means. I think we're not going to catch up for a long time with what it means that we've become used as a society to the horrorism. And that, as you say, you can scroll through your feed, and sometimes it's a penguin going off into the distance, and sometimes it's a brutal assassination.
I wanted to mention briefly Charles Moore's notes this week. He says he's actually very sad to see Amol Rajan departing from the Today programme, and it's reminded him of the old arguments about accents. He says that you want a national broadcaster with an accent that has clarity and authority. It doesn't have to be English necessarily, but it needs to sound well-educated and enunciated. Arabella, what did you make of that?
Thank God for Charles Moore, is all I could say. No, I agree completely. I want to hear people enunciate properly on the radio, and I'd like my children to hear that as we do the school run as well. I mean, I'm not a great Today programme listener, to be perfectly frank, but Amol didn't speak to me. I don't know what you two think.
I'm glad, as a radio listener, you don't have to see his diamond earring.
Yes,
that was always a bit of a relief.
I follow him on Instagram, though, and he's very active there, and I feel like I know far too much about his...
But I think Charles is right that he at least has an inquiring mind, and he would interrogate people in an interesting way. I think, well, he's going to go off and do his own media thing, so we'll have to see how that goes. But in terms of accents, I mean, I think now, I think particularly about sort of my children, and every educational video now has the kind of mandatory Defaken voice, which is quite hard to listen to. I find. I'm not sure if they find that.
What did you say? Defaken voice?
Jaffakan.
Oh, Jaffakan. Right.
Which now my eldest son is now talking slightly Jaffakan. It's a bit of a problem. It's very hard to regulate accents and so on. But I think Charles makes a good point about Scottish accents, because I think people might assume he's being a snob, but actually there are some Scottish voices that are quite hard for English people to make sense of, whereas there are other accents that are very clear and you instantly understand what.
Yeah, I don't think the
said.
BBC has a problem with accents in particular. I mean, Hugh Edwards spoke in a fine Welsh accent, and for some reason they got rid of him. I don't know. It must have been the accent. I can't remember. I didn't keep up with the story.
Just another anti-Welsh.
An anti-Welsh pogrom. But actually, I mean, the more regional accents there are on the BBC, the better, because there certainly was a time, of course, a long time ago now, but if somebody had a Scots accent and they were on the BBC, they had to learn how to do RP, and obviously it's better to have a diversity of accents. I think Amal Rajan is a very, very clever and very cultured person. I wish him well in his next stage, not least because I will probably be able to listen to him in his next stage. I decided about 20 years ago that there was one secret to the happiness. To happiness in life in general, which is not to listen to the Today programme. It's amazing, if you don't listen to the Today programme, you can start the day in a wonderful mood, and it stays for hours. Whereas if you do listen to the Today programme, you bore everyone close to you from about 9 a.m. till about the evening, and sometimes onwards, about the atrociousness of their interviewing style, the appalling habits of inviting on a politician and then inviting on some hack to interpret what the politician said and thus to attack the previous guest, and all of these other things, and so what you're saying is, and and the sort of habit of whenever you have anyone slightly to the right of the Green Party, that they get treated as if they're a war criminal, and all of those things, and I'm sorry, I wish we had more time for that, but we've got to move on. Why? Why? The next segment's about the weather, or it doesn't matter. It's going to be a bore talking about his new report. All of those irritating things that distinguish the Today programme mean that I'm afraid I haven't really kept very closely on top of Amal's time there, but I look forward to his next act for sure.
I wanted to also briefly touch on Mary Killen's piece. She is lamenting the decline of the landline. She's saying that we all lose something when we can no longer just pick up the phone and call someone. And she says a phone call, an iPhone call is not the same thing, and particularly not when you look at someone. Freddy, are you lamenting the landline too?
Yeah, I mean, we do have one, though we don't use it. I do miss the landline. I mean, when I was at school, there would be a phone booth that you would go and make your phone, and that was always quite. I mean, you'd sort of, if you wanted to talk to your parents, you'd go to a phone, and I thought that was always something quite nice about that. But that's probably just sort of weak-need nostalgia. I'm pro landline, but nobody uses them anymore.
Well, you definitely don't want the surprise video call. Terrible things happen when you do that.
Awful.
So that's absolutely no.
Or if you do an accidental video call outward.
Yes.
That can happen.
I mean, I'm saying both.
Yeah.
Both.
Avoid all. Yeah.
Massively to be avoided.
You're confronted with your face.
Well, you suddenly realise
No,
somebody's been
awful.
looking at you for a while.
Oh, no, I've had people accidentally call me whilst cleaning their bathrooms. Anything can happen. But so you've got to make sure that. But the best thing about not having a landline, by the way, is you don't get so many dodgy calls. You don't get all of those call centre things. Yeah. Which most people I know who have a landline, they're now plagued by Indian engineers telling them that their computer's been hacked and here's how you can solve it, and it's only by transferring your life savings to somewhere in Delhi. Almost everyone I know who has a landline suffers from that, and of course that is a real plague, particularly for elderly people. So I'm all for not having landlines. I don't particularly miss them. I don't think we were better off particularly with them.
My grandmother used to pick up, and I do miss this sort of ceremony. She used to pick up the phone and say, "Gatehouse 637."
Yes.
And I do. That was a sort of familiar. It was a familiar sort of ceremonial thing of my childhood, and I think I actually knew quite a lot about her life because the phone was in the hall. Yeah. So she used to, yes, So now, of course, you wouldn't necessarily have these sort of you know, these snippets, these little floating bits of, you know, other people's lives that reach you, you know, and now I think, you know, it's all conducted in a sort of vault of someone's phone, isn't it? We wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't, you know.
I love the way the oldies do that, but still, they
What,
answer the phone
637?
and they say the numbers.
I
Or
love
their
it.
surname.
In
Some
case
will go, Murray? That's a very... And also, don't say goodbye. That's a very... You just put the phone down.
My grandmother used to do that. Yes, totally.
That was such a charming one there. No sign-off. Brutal end to the conversation.
Whereas all my phone conversations with my children are all through the Alexa, so the last thing I hear is my daughter going, Alexa, hang up. In a Jamaican voice. Yeah, Alexa.
Alexa. Talking of childhood, we have Patrick Kidd writing about why children need to be exposed to alcohol from a young age, not necessarily drinking it, but being kind of aware of cherry brandy lollipops or non-alcoholic drinks or those pint pot sweets. He says it's very important for children to be aware of alcohol so that they grow up taking it seriously and it's a part of their life. Freddie, what did you make of that?
I think I broadly agree. My mother's French, and on the French side of our family, they do that very well. You know, children are sort of introduced to wine in a very normal way, and it doesn't seem like binge drinking doesn't instantly appeal to them in a way it probably does for Brits. I'm not sure I've set a good example. One of the rules I tried to give myself and my children was not to ever let them see me drunk. But I failed on that front. It's actually quite hard.
It's quite hard. Particularly in the morning.
Yeah. And it's,
Particularly on the school run.
Particularly at 9:30 a.m., you know.
Today very
you
much.
can't avoid them at that time in the morning. And so I think I've failed on that front, and I've failed to set. But the great expert on this is Arabella, who's written a book.
Yes, I don't come to this dispassionately as a topic. So I'm not here to plug my book. My mother and I wrote a book about how we both got sober in Alcoholics Anonymous within 9 months of each other. It's very difficult, you know. I love this idea that as the French do, that you have a little thimble of wine with your parents. You know, unfortunately, the exposure that I had to alcohol as a child was intense and frightening and violent. And so, you know, do I think children? I believe that there is a kind of... It depends whether your parents are addicts or not. It depends what you see modelled for you. You know, if you see quite frightening, alarming things as a child to do with alcohol, you might say to yourself, as I did, I will never be like that. I will never drink. And then, you know, amazingly, the mimetic power, the pedestal that we put our parents on, suddenly you find yourself doing it yourself. You know, so I do feel... You know, my husband drinks. I'm not at all, you know, my children are around alcohol all the time. But I never want to say, you know, I don't know. I never want them to see him drunk because that is something, as the child of two alcoholics, that I feel it really is pernicious, actually, because it's very confusing for children as well.
But one of the interesting things, of course, is that the growth in non-alcoholic drinks in pubs and so on.
Yeah,
which
that's
I just
wild.
don't see why it's. I don't see why you know, this whole thing about, you know, acculturation to drink. Surely that stuff is a good sign, because it means that, for instance, people don't have to avoid going to social occasions where you know there's drink. You can go to the pub and you can have a non-alcoholic beer, or whether you're driving or you just don't want to drink or whatever other reason. What it points to is that, I mean, Freddie gives the example of the French, and I think we always look to the French as being sort of better at this than we are. And equally, we in Britain tend to think of the Americans as being uniquely worse, because the sort of the way in which many American teenagers are really kept away from alcohol, as if it is a much more dangerous substance than it is, and then go to university and get into that kind of down a bottle of vodka and throw up everywhere sort of culture. It really means that they haven't got it right either. And I mean, there's lots of things to be said about it, but I would just say one thing. I mean, I'm, as some readers will know, I'm never been in favour of legalisation of marijuana. And in New York State, where I spent a lot of time, that is legal, and you can see the consequences of it. I always think when there's always this argument, well, you know, X isn't as dangerous as alcohol, or Y isn't as addictive as alcohol. And I always think, well, considering the amount of problems a lot of us have in our societies and individually with this totally legal normalized substance. Are you sure you want to introduce other things? You know, I mean,
And
it's
combine them.
interesting.
Combine them with booze.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? That the sort of anti-prohibitionists on marijuana people,
Yes.
they always cite the comparison with alcohol, but nobody has an easy relationship with alcohol.
Yes.
It's true.
Yeah.
Just to finish, Arabella, you may
Yes.
not be wanting your children to drink too much, but you
Yes.
do admit in your notes on this week that you occasionally drug them with Calpol.
Absolutely, not so occasionally.
With what?
Calpol.
With Calpol.
Oh, yes.
Routinely.
And there's a great
yes.
detail actually in your piece, which is that 5 tons of Calpol are bought every day in this country.
Yeah, it's bananas.
Which didn't actually
Yeah.
surprise me because I'm heavily reliant on Calpol for my children. But what is the appeal?
I think the appeal, which is that Calpol is not sold to us as something that might, that might alleviate symptoms. I mean, of course, we know that, but what it's sold as is we're sold with the end result that your child is asleep or happy. So I just was fascinated by how clever that is, really, and how, I don't ever go anywhere with my children without Calpol. I'm unclear whether they need it or not, but it almost doesn't really matter because it calms me down. And then I think, well, I've just, I've mitigated against any potential catastrophe.
Is it herbal or medical?
No, it's medical. I mean, it's paracetamol
No.
with quite a lot of sugar in it, which is why children are willing to take it. So it's not marketed as a sedative, but most British parents would give their children Calpol in order to send them to sleep.
Well, as you say in your book, the real genius is the syringe.
Yeah.
That you use, so you draw it out with the syringe and then you inject it into the child's mouth.
And Michael McIntyre is
Whilst they're
brilliant
asleep
on
on
this. Yeah.
But I think the syringe is great because it makes you feel like you're doing something responsible.
Yes.
While
Really? You always get that feeling
Yeah,
when you
every time.
use a
Every
syringe.
time. And you
And then I say, and while I'm
tot
at it,
up.
I may as well.
Wow.
Give
And lots of
myself a
countries
day.
don't have an equivalent of Calpol. And
No,
I've got
no,
some
in
friends who
France,
live
no,
abroad
no.
and they bring Calpol with them because they just don't
It is a
have something
uniquely
similar.
British phenomenon that we have happened. But of course, in 2018, everyone became very worried about it and said, is this the heroine of childhood? But this has been going on for years and years. I mean, think of the Victorians, as I mentioned in my piece, think of the Punch piece, a newborn with a bottle of opium, a lovely draught of opium and off to sleep. It's why if you ask, in fact, I do believe that that medicines did used to be stronger. If you ask most boomers or before, if you say, did your children sleep? They all say, oh, yes, of course they did. They're not in this hypervigilance of modern intensive parenting where you have a monitor, you have a picture of your child there asleep. You just, and frankly, it sounds like it was better.
Yeah, Valium was much stronger back in the day.
Yes.
Now you have to pop loads.
We'll take it from you.
Douglas, Arabella, Freddy, thank you very much for joining.